Hello, Exiles. I want to give you an update on how I kind of continued my Deadeye Wonder League starter build and the direction I took it in. So if you've seen the video that I uploaded before the league, where I tested out kind of some setups for 5-way running, you would have seen that I have used an Exploding Armor, and in general I want to make a build that kind of scales explosions, because explosions scale really well with AoE, and so does Kinetic Blast to a degree, and having kind of a skill that has very, very good screen coverage inherently, on top of having uh, explosions on your build, is very, very nice to play. The idea behind this build is that we are getting a lot of AoE from cluster jewels. I'll go into that a bit later, as well as like a bit from here. Make our explosions really, really, really large. They cover not quite half the screen, I would say. I think the radius is 40 or 4.0 meters. Before I go like further into this, I'm just gonna show you how this looks like. It's basically just Dune's Legion. Single target isn't very great, even though my gear is really, really good, but that's not what this build is made for. So just gonna Legion here, we stand in the middle, hold down our kinetic blast.
My mana is gone.
Unlucky something survived. Probably because of the breach walls here. But as you can see, you can't even see the enemies on the screen anymore. They just immediately disappear. Instant just something dies, everything dies. This one had a proxy shield. Most of the time I can actually pop the entire Legion. Just manage the explosion. I think I'm gonna do the Aleph encounter here, just so that the next two Legions aren't kind of bricked by the breach walls. A pretty annoying thing. If you're wondering, by the way, why there's no like sound effects for my kinetic blast, I had to like turn off the sound in the game files, because the lag produced by this was actually so intense that the game was very unenjoyable to play. Disabling the sound does improve performance a lot if you're playing kinetic blast, so if you're having issues with that, I can recommend it. Looks like, yeah, this one popped immediately. You can see how badly this lags when there's like proxy shields and ice prisons. And it's just kind of something that you have to deal with. But yeah, this is what this looks like. You stand in the middle, you hold down your right mouse button or whatever. Anything that isn't behind a proxy shield basically dies instantly. And here's the last Legion. And that's basically the entire map cleared. Also real quick. I'm gonna do this later, I'm not gonna bore you with that. So really, really fast clear speed, massive AoE, and basically instantly delete legions, instantly delete the unstable breach encounters. If you're fighting a high fortress, you can just stand in the middle and hold down your kinetic blast. Really, really good. Any kind of non-Tier 17 content, this build basically just destroys at really high speed. And it's pretty fun to play. The only downside is both Warrior's End and the physical explosions, for example, from Crusader Armor, aren't very visible. They're not very satisfying to play like Herald of Ice or Profane Bloom. It's a bit sad. I wish these had like a nicer visual effect at least. But you do feel them like impacting. So clear. Okay, now I'm gonna go a bit more into detail on how this build actually works. And the core concept is that we are scaling the AoE of our explodey items, and best source of AoE is cluster jewels, medium cluster jewels. And we're using a third dominance and towering threat on those. Those give a combined 35% increased AoE, 10 from towering threat, 25 from the third dominance. Towering threat also gives a bit of life, which is nice. Our defenses are actually okay for like what this build is supposed to be. Shouldn't really ever die in tier 16 maps. Doing this is more than sufficient. We're using 4 of these cluster jewels. Right, 35% increased AoE each. Times 4, that is 140% increased AoE on clusters. If this anoint, gives me another 15%. Then Dying Sun gives me another 18%. That combined should put us at 173. 173%. I think I have some AoE rolled here. Yeah, these two have percent AoE rolled on the small node as well, so that's another 4%, so 177. And then I'm using Zeal's Amplifier as my shield. This actually is kind of decent for KB in general, just as like a starter shield. Gives some spell damage, some life, some suppress. But the reason I'm using it, of course, is 1% increased AoE per enemy killed recently, up to 50%. And with how fast this build clears, as you've seen, this is basically permanently at 50%. So all of this combined is 227% increased AoE. That makes our explosions really, really large. Okay, now our explosions are really, really big now, but they're not really doing much damage, so we have to scale that somehow. A very easy way to scale the physical explosion is to use Grace of the Goddess as your wand. But this actually isn't that good in terms of like DPS. If you use a, let's say, LA wand like this is the wand that I used to use before I switched to the full explosion setup. This will actually deal more damage than my Grace of the Goddess even on this build. But this one gives me 127. You have these rolls, you can technically get way more than that, but they get really expensive if you have really, really high rolls. 127 of physical as some kind of extra element. And this does apply to the physical damage from explosions. On top of that, I'm using Hatred on Guardian's Blessing. This is another 40% of physical as extra. And I'm also using a Balance of Terror jewel, which gives me physical as extra as well, 40%. So this adds up to quite a lot. All of this scales the explosion from the armor. Then on top of that, I'm using one large cluster jewel with elemental damage. The increased elemental damage with these conditions, which are pretty much always up because we have mixed damage anyway. This does apply obviously to our armor, because again, most of the explosion is actually dealing elemental damage. The part that is still physical, we are actually converting with our gloves and our Watcher's Eye. Yeah, these are pretty good for scaling the damage on this armor. These small nodes on these cluster jewels also give 10%. If you add up all of the increased damage and physics extra that we have on this build, then enemies will explode actually for more than 100% of their maximum life, which is why this basically guarantees that if you kill one enemy, the entire pack will immediately pop. One downside is that obviously it's only 27% chance to explode, and to kind of augment this, I'm also using Oria's End. Issue with this is obviously that this is base elemental damage and not base physical, meaning that this doesn't deal nearly as much damage as the physical explosion from this, but it is still solid, it is still very noticeable, so you should really use this if you want to play this build. These two together are really, really nice. Now, one thing that you could do if you wanted to like really scale this to the extreme is, instead of using Grace of the Goddess, you would use a synthesized wand with explosion implicit. Now, those are usually really, really expensive. Realistically, you would have to mirror one of those. So just for the people who really wanted to push this build to the extreme. That is kind of the upgrade you would do once you go past this unique wand. This thing is actually pretty expensive if you want good rolls on it, so this is not really something that you can get early. Anyway, this is quite an endgame item already. The rest of the items on this build are pretty standard, I would say. Might have already shown the gloves. They have conversion on it, but otherwise it's just live res, attack speed, and then suppress and rage on it implicit. Boots, live movement speed res, action speed implicit. Live res ring, minus mana cost. Enemies, of course. Amulet, live attributes, some damage. Chaos res. Then the fledgling for Farthroat. All of these items again are pretty generic. Headhunter as well, of course. You would use most of these on a regular Wonder build too. That's not really specific to the Explodey setup. Same with the flasks, Dying Sun, Quicksilver, Silver Flask. This one is actually something that I want to swap out at some point. Not sure if I'm gonna do that, because I will play a different build at some point soon, and I'm saving up for that already, so I don't know if I'm upgrading this, but the way I would do that is by getting new boots that have also long kill. Now, one other upgrade that you would have to make at some point on this build is the chest piece. As you see, this is only the regular tier 1 explosion mod. Obviously, you can get an elevated version of this. The elevated version goes up to 35% explode chance, which is noticeably better than this. And also gives you a bit of increased AoE, I think up to 12%. So that would be a very solid further upgrade. If you want to push it even further than that, you can even make a chest piece that has the Explodey mod and the Reach mod that gives you lightning damage for each shocked enemy you've killed recently. This is the same mod that you can find on Aegies Mirror. Now this is a shield that I've in the last video already recommended. It's kind of a very, very good starter item. It makes you deal a lot of damage during clear, and this lightning damage actually does apply to your explosions as well. Now this is flat damage, so it's not as good as adding versus extra, but it is still noticeable that your explosions are dealing a lot more damage if you have killed like a lot of enemies recently with something like this. Now, problem with this is that you have to use Recombinator to move this over to a better base, and then you also have to move this over to a base that already has the explosion mod. It's basically just a luck craft, right? You cannot beat the 50-50 Recombinator odds of it picking the wrong base, pretty much. I've actually tried this multiple times, and it ended up picking the Grasping Mail base 4 times in a row. And because I don't want to play this build like super long term anymore, because I've already planned out my next one, I don't think I'm gonna bother with finishing crafting a chest like this. But yeah, you want this Ashes mod on a chest piece that also has the Crusader explosion. Yeah, the gem setups, by the way, I didn't mention that yet. They're pretty standard for what you would expect out of a Kinetic Blast build. There's nothing really special in here. Only things that are kind of weird, I guess, is that I'm not using Hydrosphere on my Spellslinger, only Tornado. Mostly because I don't have the sockets. And a reservation I could actually fix, but I just don't have enough sockets on the build, and I don't really think it's worth using an unset ring for that. If I were to upgrade this ring, I would get like an amethyst ring, a really good one, and not an unset. I'm using Heart of Ash instead, just for some physics extra and the extra flame explosions, I guess. Otherwise, also using ally weakness, of course, which I occasionally will just press to get the buff from Balance of Terror. And then, yeah, I guess the Animate Guardian is also somewhat unusual. You don't have to use this. In fact, this dies very easily, juiced content. But so long as this is up, you get Fortify from Kingmaker, as well as Crit Multi, also from Kingmaker, and then the Hatred from Guardian's Blessing. The AG, by the way, is using Kingmaker, Roofcoat's Pelt, and then just some rares that give resistances and life regenerate when I'm alive. Not really much to it. It is a pretty standard AG setup. If you don't want to run this, you can run Ballistas or something here with Kinetic Rain, for example. Kinetic Rain of Impact. regular doesn't work with ballistas. Or whatever other setup you want. There's not actually that many one skills that really work with ballistas if you have enemies, so you can also run something completely different here. Other than that, yeah, we just have shield charge and no mark here, and this is Sigil of Power and Guard skill, Graf, and Frostbring. The rest is pretty standard, I would say. So yeah, this is probably where I will end up keeping this character. Not really gonna progress this any further. Giving you some kind of ideas for the people who want to push this further, how to progress this. I want to play something else, and I don't really see a point in investing into a character that I'm going to reroll anyway very soon. Maybe you want to try out this build. I think it's pretty fun. It's really, really fast. Like doing Legion with this on dunes, you can actually earn decent amount of currency just because of how quickly you clear them. Alright, yeah, that is it. Hope you have fun with this build, and goodbye.